Well, I want to dwell on how we've changed as a society and how that's contributing to the increase in the homeless population. And again, going back from the historical perspective, we've had plenty of terrible wars, in the past, and let's talk about the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea, of course, in Vietnam. And Vietnam is probably more familiar to people today as creating the post-Vietnam experience of a displaced veteran who is having terrible mental issues. But if there were post-war bumps in the homeless situation after the Civil War, World War I, or World War II, it doesn't seem to show up on the social radar, historical radar. But now it is. We have these serious problems, and this, I think, is kind of coming back to multiple of the same issues as a society. Are you suggesting then, as a society, then we've changed because there's more substances available that are abused than we had maybe post-World War II, other than alcohol has been abused obviously for a long time, but we're talking about other substances, and that's complicating the problem.
It is, and these substances have profound effects in a very short amount of time on our bodies and our minds. It seems like every era has its killer drug. There's crack and
Right.
speed and
Right.
these sorts of things, and now it's fentanyl. And all the others, right?
Sure,
The others are still there. They didn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
And now it's all kind of being used at the same time. But yeah, everything's extraordinarily cheap. It's amazingly easy to get. If someone wants it, they can get it. I saw there was a stunt Rudy Giuliani did. He and two other government officials, when he was mayor, they went out on the street and they put on some funny sunglasses and they said, "We're going to go buy crack and show how easy it was." And they did. They bought crack. It was that easy. They're the most recognized man in New York City. No problem. Guarantee you, it's available to whoever wants it. And it's that component of it, the easy supply, is a big problem, and that speaks to all sorts of other issues. I mean, we have big issues with our southern neighbor and their challenges with crime. Right. I personally, I love Mexico. I'm there every month. I love it so much, but it's so dangerous. It is a narco state.
Is part of this, the increased access to controlled substances, drugs, partly influenced by the fact that our affluence as a society as a whole has grown so we have more leisure time, we have more money to spend. It sounds kind of odd. We're talking about people who are homeless, but
Right.
Is there some play from that aspect of it?
I suspect there has to be. I mean, I don't have a definitive answer to that. It's a terrific sociological question, but it's the ease of recreational use is there, and there's no question that is a component. I don't think it's like it was messaged by the former First Lady, just say no to drugs, which is very much a recreational message. I don't think it's quite that prevalent that people are using recreation and they slide into these harder things and they fall off the map. I know that exists. We all know it exists. It exists even with moms and dads and so forth, especially with things as powerful as fentanyl. But that's a drug abuse problem that interplays with homelessness, and it is not the driver of homelessness. It's a component of it, right? But it is not the driver. We have a lot of barely functional, non-homeless people who are drug addicts and alcoholics, and that's a real problem. But I don't think that it is a core component of the homelessness problem.
Well, my impression from your comments is that this is starting to sound similar to epidemiological investigation into the causes of certain very serious illnesses. No one can identify one individual cause of why someone or some group of people come down with a particular serious illness, but they just have to take into account about 7 or 8 different factors. They were exposed to this, they lived there, they smoked that, or whatever, and somehow it all comes together, and no one knows for sure what the definitive answer is.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and it's human nature to look for the source. I mean, it's one of the beautiful things about human nature.
You can't solve it if you can't figure out the cause.
Yeah,
we
try to seek for the source, but with this problem, as valuable as that is, and it is valuable, we have to deal with the existing problem today, which is really a remediation issue. It's how do we fix the problem that we have today, and as valuable as it is to try and stop it before it starts. The old, how do you stop crime? You stop it before it starts. There's this huge value in that, right?
Sure.
Try and keep people on a more productive path. But we have such a mass of the problem now that we cannot ignore the need for triage.
2 years ago, there was a federal court decision out of Orange County, but it pertains to the city of Los Angeles and the county of Los Angeles. It was a very lengthy opinion by a federal judge. It became controversial, ended up getting reversed, but the original opinion by the district court judge, meaning the trial judge, was an injunction. I think this goes back into the order was entered in the spring of 2021, and the injunction said that the city and county had to get to place every single homeless individual by October, women and children first, but then the men by October, and had to find places for them. And there was an order that said you have to spend $1 billion to do it, and so forth. And the general theme that was running through the order, as I recall it, is that the homeless issue in Southern California is driven by systemic racism. What do you have to say about that?
With respect to the judge, there is no evidence whatsoever that racism plays a meaningful role, if any role, in the homelessness problem. It is not a problem that is dominated by any one ethnicity. It is, most homeless are white men. The argument that is made there parallels the argument that it is intended to parallel, to my understanding, the argument that the prison population is disproportionately black and Latino, Hispanic, and so forth because of systemic racism. I can understand that argument, that line of logic, far better, and I'm not saying whether I agree with it or not, I just understand it much better than I understand that argument being applied to the homeless population. Mm-hmm. The homeless population is, getting back to your point earlier, it is much more nuanced. There is much more going on there than a confluence of economic, socioeconomic, and other issues that do seriously influence people as they end up going into crime or so forth. But it's just, there's no evidence to suggest that homelessness is born of systemic racism. It's unfortunate because I think it's looking at the wrong source. It's going to come up with the wrong solutions. It's, at best, it's a waste of time.
In terms of percentage of African Americans as part of the homeless community, is it overrepresented as a percentage of the overall population in Southern California?
So there is a disproportionate representation. The African American community there's more African Americans who are homeless than compose the population. Similar to, there are more Latinos who are homeless, there are more Pacific Islanders who are homeless than compose the population. And I think it's easy to look at those numbers and draw a conclusion. And I'm not ridiculing this or diminishing it. I understand that serious thought went on this by serious people. But I think drawing the conclusion that because of that disproportionality that we have a systemic racism problem that's driving the homelessness issue, I think that fails to understand the nuances of it and the complexity of the human condition that leads us there. Mm-hmm. If someone wanted to make an argument that some component of that had to do with that, fine. But I don't think it does. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it's accurate, and I don't think it leads to a meaningful solution of the problem to focus on that as being one of the core drivers of the homelessness problem. There's no evidence that suggests it is, other than a disproportionate representation, and sometimes a disproportionate representation should force the viewer to ask why. Mm-hmm. As opposed to immediately drawing a conclusion. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And drawing a conclusion that comes from a different population, right? It was a different problem that particular theory was developed, and it's being applied to this, I think, because it's convenient. not because it necessarily accurately reflects, with all respect to the folks who are saying that, I don't think it accurately reflects the core nature of the problem.
Well, coming back to the medical analogy again, if you have the wrong diagnosis, you will have the inappropriate treatment.
That's exactly right. I think I worry that is where we would end up with focusing on that too much.
Well, with money, and you mentioned the loss of faith, and we expect our political leaders to solve our problems. That's why we elect them to office. So we have problems, and problems change over the years, but we want our political leaders to come up with solutions. Homelessness is a problem that the political folks talk about all the time, but not only does it not get solved, it's getting worse, and it's creating a fundamental loss of faith in our ability of our leaders to solve, I think in California, probably nationally as well, is one of the two most important problems as a society that we're facing. Do you have any thoughts on how this impacts our overall system of democracy if our people we put into office can't solve these problems for us?
Yeah, it directly relates to the popularity of candidates. I think the great snapshot of this is when now former President Trump was first running for office. The two most interesting candidates in that election were Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And they were really just mirror images of the same issues. And that was anger. I don't mean it's the reflexive New York Times, angry white men thing. What I mean is voter anger that nothing is being done, that the people who are tasked with doing the most basic things of the form of government aren't doing it. And that creates an extraordinary sense of unfairness. And unfairness is a powerful, powerful emotion. And Americans, I think, feel that our political leaders are not performing, by any stretch of the imagination, the most basic tasks that they're expected to perform. And this goes regionally, here locally, regionally, statewide, and federal. And that's becoming a disaffection that is driving the political discourse really throughout the United States. And I think it is, right now we have a presidential election coming up. And a lot of pundits are breathlessly saying, how can Donald Trump be so popular after what happened and so forth? Donald Trump is a controversial human being. He's done controversial things. If you don't like that he's popular, ask why he's popular. Don't dismiss the people who support him as crazy. Same thing, like, don't dismiss the people who support Bernie Sanders as just a bunch of communist students who want everything paid for them. Ask why they're angry. That's what matters. You have to start digging into this.
Why aren't we doing that anymore? It is such a insightful comment. Ask why they're angry. But the political discourse now is people who don't agree with me are bad or evil. And so why don't those people agree with me, and why are they angry? What's driving that?
So, that's been a recurring tide in a free democracy, in our wonderful free democracy. That anger has been a recurring tide, and we have ebbs and flows. There have been eras. Fortunately, we have newspaper accounts, right? We have all this written down, and then at some point it became, we could see it on TV, and now it's social media. The anger and there are points where Americans were just simply more angry than they were at other points. I mean, for crying out loud, as Americans, we fought a war against each other. Thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans were slaughtered. So we're not, disaffection is not new to us, but the rapidity with which it is disseminated for these, right?
That's new.
That's new.
That's new.
We never get away from it. We never get away from it. There's always anger right at our fingertips. There's always unfairness. There's always a problem. There's always something to be upset or unhappy about. Now, alternatively, the power of these also could disseminate wonderful things, right?
Sure.
But we're human beings. We tend to look at the traffic accident. It's in our nature. So we actually have to train ourselves to start focusing on those things about life that are very different, the things that are beautiful. How can we fix the things that are imperfect? But unfortunately, as human beings, it's our condition to look at the accident and allow our emotions to run away with them.
And blame somebody.
Yeah, absolutely.
And blame somebody. And a complicating factor in dealing with homelessness is that you have the speed of information or data or misinformation, disinformation, whatever your point of view may be, that accelerates the political divisiveness of this particular issue, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And the real challenge for electeds and candidates is the fact that, the anger about things not being right is grounded in truth.
Right.
That a lot has been spent, a lot has been spoken, and it does get worse every year. So there's responsibility here. And the responsibility clearly lies at the feet of our electeds, whether it's local city, whether it's county, whether it's state, whether it's national. They're all responsible. And in the eyes of the voters, when you ask them who's responsible, each one of them is responsible. You can prioritize. You can say which one of these is responsible. It ends up being all of them. It's a really unique issue. Right?
We'll come back. There's the old, truism is that we get the political leaders that we deserve, and who we elect, those kinds of things. And coming back to your point, I think you used the word the widget.
Right.
We need a magic widget, and I think the widget that used to work was this compassionate removal. That as a society we no longer tolerate. It's distasteful to us now, either because of court decisions, legislation, all of which to some extent reflects the attitude of contemporary Americans. So have we denied, as a people, have we denied to our political leaders the widget we need to solve this problem?
You're exactly right. The reality is that as much as there's legitimate anger, our elected leaders do not have the ability to fix the problem fully. They cannot. It is illegal to fix the problem. It is against the law for them to adequately fix the problem because we don't have that widget. We don't have the ability to compassionately, and it does need to be compassionate. There has to be very clear law and an organization and finances and a system put together that allows for taking people off the street, getting them the help they need, and enforcing that help. Right now you can take people off the street, and the most you can do, to my understanding, and I'm sure there's some complexities to it, but let's talk about mental health. If someone's a danger to themselves or other, you can remove them. You can 5150 them. That's the term. And you have, I think it's
2 days.
It's 48 hours.
48 hours.
2 days. So what happens in 2 days? It's triage, and if someone is on a bridge and going to jump, that could really have some value. Getting past that apex of crisis. But this is not something that gets solved over the course of 2 days. People don't resolve the mental health issues, don't resolve the substance use issues, don't resolve the confluence of the two, and all the other issues. At this point, they are on the street, so they're economic issues. They don't have the money to go somewhere. All those things don't get solved by taking somebody off the street for 2 days. It's a woefully inadequate tool. So absent that, you can build all the permanent supportive housing that you want and the wraparound supportive services, and you can try and convince people, and you're going to get a small proportion of people who are willing to try and go through that process of trying and failing and trying and failing. But it's nothing near the proportion of success that you can achieve by having a legitimate, responsible system that legally can remove people from the street and get them the help they need. And until we have that legislation, none of this is going to work.
Throwing, quote, money at the issue to build shelters. And it sounds like that's a little bit trying to stay afloat in a very fast rising tide environment because the homeless population, I suspect, is increasing faster than we can build places for the individuals who are suffering that misfortune. Money, though, to build the shelters or to build the apartments, to house people who are homeless, is treating the results, it seems to me, not treating the cause. And I think that what you're suggesting is that treating the results is not going to solve the problem. The problem is just going to get worse. We have to treat the cause or deal with the cause.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just not that easy for folks to make a choice to heal. They're in too deep. And you can have a wonderful home that's available to them. You can have available services. You can have available treatments. People can take advantage of some component of that. But I think as anyone who, and most of us these days know someone who has a loved one or a friend or a colleague who has been, take the mental health thing aside, who has fallen victim to serious addiction, they know very well that a couple of weeks in rehab isn't going to do it. Mm-hmm. It is a lifetime effort, and it takes massive resources. Families spend extraordinary amounts of money and time and effort trying to heal their loved ones, and it fails a lot. So if that fails with families that have the resources and the ability and the love and all this sort of thing, how is this going to help when you just take people off the street with all of their challenges, put them in a room with a kitchen, and say, here are some available support services, off you go. It's not respecting humanity. It's not respecting human nature. It's not respecting that this is much, much, much harder than people, for the most part, have the capability of resolving on their own, even if they're surrounded by all the resources in the world. It requires structure, and it requires ensuring that people do the things that will make them better. And like it or not, that requires what we call force, and it's a term that people are avert from. Electeds really worry about using that term, and obviously, force can be abused. You can handle things in a way that is not humane, but that's not what we're talking about here. That's not what people want. And this is across progressive voters, conservative voters, independent voters. All of them want some kind of solution that treats people with dignity, but at the same time enforces their care. And that can exist.
Well, let me just kind of move the crosshairs just a little bit. We've been talking about compassionate care, for the homeless, because as we sit here today, we do not give our political leaders the tools, the widget to actually solve the problem. So basically what we're saying is that currently this problem is not solvable, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's correct.
So then those of the society who are not homeless, but yet they're adjacent to homeless encampments and things of that nature, it impacts the quality of life for everybody else as well. Any comments or thoughts or observations on how the homeless issue impacts the quality of life for those who are not homeless?
Yeah, I mean, people don't have the ability to really go outside in the way that they once were. It's suddenly people start behaving in a way that they would if they were living in a war zone or in a highly crime-ridden area, New York in the 70s or something like that. These kind of stereotypical things that we think of that are very unsafe places. You have the same situation in every neighborhood throughout California, whether it is an up-and-coming neighborhood, whether it's a financially distressed neighborhood, whether it's an affluent neighborhood. Homelessness, the tentacles of homelessness are everywhere, and everyone sees them all the time and deals with them all the time, and people change their behavior. You don't feel comfortable with your kid going to the restroom on their own. Playing in the park, got to be careful about that. What's in the sand. I mean, people think about things that you never would have thought about 15 years ago. It has changed the entire dynamic of how people plan their day, and that is profound.
Is there any data to correlate the increase in the homeless population to certain types of crimes? For example, if you have a large homeless population, does the number of assaults in the community go up? Does the number of robberies or burglaries go up? Do we have any data on
Yes.
that?
Yeah. The biggest one is theft. That is huge, and it's compounded by, again, our laws, because theft is really no longer a crime in California. Under $1,000, this is.
It's not a felony; it's a misdemeanor, and
you're not arrested. The police don't even come out. There's no.
We're talking about the smash and grab.
Yeah, whatever it might be. If it's under $1,000, I mean, the police, their hands are tied, and they don't have the resources to deal with it. First part, but there's nothing they can do. It is not. It's not something that they can address, because legally, it's just really not something that matters. And that was part of. The argument of prison populations and so forth, and there's a good argument to be said that do you take someone who steals something that is of relatively little value, do you throw them in prison? Is that the right is that the right approach? I think there's a very good argument that says maybe that's not the right approach. Maybe prison is not the right solution. I can see that argument, but allowing it to happen, that really is something that doesn't work. People, they're desperate. They're going to use the tools at their disposal to live their lives, and that includes, of course, burglary and theft, and that skyrockets. I mean, that's huge, and every year it seems like it skyrockets in every urban environment and every suburban environment throughout California. Certainly, there are things of assaults that goes up. Folks can be unpredictable. They're in crisis, and that crisis means that they can do things that normally they probably wouldn't.
Well,
and they assault folks.
Talking about the smash and grabs, theft of property less than $1,000 is a misdemeanor. It's also, I think, complicated by the California Supreme Court ruled that it's unconstitutional if you require a bail that is not commensurate with the ability of an individual to pay it. That's essentially cruel and unusual. So you put that all together, and then we see the, quote, smash and grab something less than $1,000. They don't get arrested because they're going to be bright out on the street. If they are arrested, they'll be released probably because they don't have the ability to post bail. Therefore, it'd be cruel and unusual to keep them in jail. I think as the cyclic thing all goes back. We were talking about earlier about the 3 strikes law that increased the numbers of people in the prison that beyond the capacities. I think the California prisons are at 187, 188% capacity, which the court said is cruel and unusual. Therefore, reduce the capacity or the population to 127% of capacity. Therefore, the prisons haven't been constructed to keep up with the growth in the prison population, and so it's all kind of feeding on itself in that sense. And from the homelessness perspective, it means that many more people are on the streets where maybe they might still would be in jail or prison for whatever crime that they committed.
That's right, and it feeds into the argument that, and speaking to prison, and potentially the racism argument of, is a prison cell the right solution for most infractions? And there's a very good argument that it isn't. But ignoring it is not the right solution either, right? I mean, if someone does something that is societally damaging or damaging to themselves, I get it. Don't throw them in prison for 10 years. Totally get that. But what about rehabilitation? What about trying to improve that person's life so that this isn't done again? They're not harming themselves. They're not harming the person they already harmed by whatever theft they did. We're missing that widget. We cannot take, if you decide to reform prison, you have to have something that cares for those folks who shouldn't be in prison, arguably, but also are unable to take care of themselves.
Well, let's take that one step. Let's say hypothetically we have somebody that is homeless, runs into a store, does a smash and grab, $700 or $800. This person today is not getting arrested, but yet we don't want to put them in prison. These souls in prison for 10 years. But on the other hand, we're uncomfortable about not doing anything. So in that hypothetical where you have someone that ran in and grabbed less than $1,000 of whatever it was, what's the middle ground? How do you take care of that so that they don't continue to do that and they can improve the quality of their life? Any thoughts on how we can do that?
Yeah, I mean, there's the homeless component, set aside for a moment, because there's a lot of crime that's being done by folks that aren't homeless, and it's being done with relative impunity because the consequences aren't there. Right. And this is throughout the U.S., whether it's California or Washington, D.C., or New York, or whatever it might be. There are good arguments, and there are programs that are proven to work, and they're not perfect, right, but there are programs, and it again requires some degree of enforcement. You can't just say to somebody who went in and stole whatever it is, I hope you show up on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, for whatever this
your
program.
Sentencing or your
yeah, exactly.
Trial, yes.
Or for whatever that program is to rehabilitate them. This is community service, counseling, mental health, whatever it might be. There's all sorts of incredible programs that exist to some degree or another, but and in some places they don't exist, and they should. But absent the ability to enforce, arrest someone, decide they don't go to prison, but they do have to go into some other kind of program in order to try and help them. That degree of force seems to be absent. It just simply, we're at that point where we just seem to be saying, okay, this isn't as big of a crime, and therefore there's no way to really address it. It just doesn't seem to make any sense.
Well, is there any state or jurisdiction in the United States has developed a program where they may have what we would call a minor offense? In California, it's less than $1,000 theft, where they have tried something other than prison and other than just not charging, but instead the sentence here is you've got to go through a rehabilitation program. Are there any states that actually have pursued that?
I mean, there's a variety of states, including California, that from time to time have done certain things like this, and they've had degrees of success. But I don't know of any that has a consistent degree of success. I'm sure I'm wrong. I just don't have that knowledge at my fingertips. Right. But there are approaches that have been deployed, and they seem to have an effect. And again, they're not 100% effective, but nothing's 100% effective. Prison's not 100% effective, right? Recidivism is huge. So the totem of, we've got a 40% recidivism rate, isn't necessarily the right totem. The question is, what about the 60% who actually move on and do better? And the programs exist. I mean, there's it's been proven that after-school programs help reduce crime among youth. Taking that time up in the afternoon. I talk to folks all the time, principals, vice principals, and so forth. In the course of my opinion research, believe it or not, we talk to folks like that, and inevitably there's that window after school, and that's where things go wrong with kids. That's the window. We called it when I was a kid, your latchkey kids, stuff like that. That's what we were. We'd come home and, let ourselves in, and, mom and dad weren't around until they got back from work. It's the same thing now. That window was a problem then, and it's a problem now. And having after-school programs, things like that, in existing facilities at schools that already exist, those things work. They're not 100% successful, but they work. They help a lot of kids avoid that sort of thing. And a lot of this is youth. But it takes an investment. It costs money. We have to pay people to be there. Those people are unique. They have a great deal. They have training. Two, they have patience. They have a desire to work there, and they're not paid very, very well. There's issues with that system and making it work. But these things have been proven to work. There was a time when it was kind of a joke. What was it? Midnight basketball, I think that was the joke, right? When one of the candidates ran, one of the presidential candidates ran on this. Was it Clinton that ran on that?
It may have been.
And it was, in conservative circles, it was mocked. Yeah. Turns out it works. Not perfect, but it works. And those sorts of things, as a society, when we start looking at where government should be spending money, these may not be bad ways to spend money.
One demographic we haven't talked about, and you just alluded to the youth, these after-school programs. In regard to the homeless population, how does it skew across the age groups?
It's you don't have a whole bunch of kids, and the kids that are obviously extremely tragic, but the framework for helping families with children is much more developed than helping single folks. The real challenge, I think, the real area for massive improvement is outside folks with kids, which again, it's imperfect now, but it works much, much better, and there's much more resources available for families with kids than there are for single folks. But I mean, it's still an issue, and it's imperfect. It needs to be improved. It needs to be much, much better. But it's far more developed than your single man or single woman.
We have very strong, long-standing programs in California, and I think that everywhere in the United States, where children who are in a difficult circumstance for whatever reason can become wards of the state. And society provides a place for them to reside. Hopefully, if they've been into trouble crime-wise, they can receive rehabilitative services, things of that nature. And those are well known. But as we talked about this, we use that compulsion, compassionate compulsion for children. We don't have a social issue with children.
Right.
But once they, quote, age out, we suddenly are in a different environment. And we do have a social issue using that same compassion and enforcement with people once they're no longer a child.
Right. Yeah, it's you're free, and that freedom means that we can't force you to do something, and that theoretically, that's great, but there seem to be very clear spaces where that doesn't apply. And we know it, right? I mean, that's why we do have a prison system, right? Because of serious infractions, violent infractions, and things like that. Why is it that we can't cross the Rubicon of understanding towards having this for folks who are experiencing other crises? And voters have crossed that Rubicon. Voters are ready for that. They are ready to see that legislation. It has to be done right, has to be compassionate, has to be funded, has to have professionals managing it. They don't want it messed up. They don't want it not to work. They don't want to make people's lives worse. But this is one of the things that we've dug in deeply, and again with qualitative and quantitative research, and it's across the spectrum. This is not something where progressives feel meaningfully different than conservatives or independents. They all are thirsting for responsible government action, which requires legislation that allows for this widget to be created.
Well, it sounds like the desire of most of the people, the majority of the people in this country, and in California, looks for a solution that would have that magic widget, but the hands of the political leaders are bound by legislation and court decisions. For example, there's a decision out there that says it's cruel and unusual punishment to require someone to come off or to ban camping in the streets unless you can put these individuals into a homeless shelter, unless there's a homeless shelter that's available for them. And once it's a constitutional decision, then of course it's written in stone until the next court decision decides that it's not a violation of the Constitution. So we've got ourselves into a conundrum, it seems.
Yeah, and it's one of the weaknesses of a functioning democracy, right? Is that it takes time for these things to really go through and be fought out at the court stage, and ultimately, they end up landing at the feet of the Supreme Court. Right. And this is a question about freedom, individual freedoms, our ability to chart our own path, even if it looks to others to be a horrible path. That's an issue, and it needs to be addressed, and at some point it will. But until that process goes through, our our leaders' hands are really going to be tied. But they do need to push that and vocalize about it. And I think that's getting back to responsibility. It is one thing to acknowledge that we don't have purview legally over this, but it is quite another to say, all right, we don't have purview for whatever reason. It needs to go. We need to push it further down the way. Either the city vocalizes and talks about how this needs to go to the next level of court, or they work to change state constitution to allow for this. These things can be done. That's what elected leaders are for. So I don't want to let them off the hook entirely by saying they don't have the ability to do it legally, but that's what legislators do. Change the law.